I guess all of this goes back to my own dissertation. When I went to graduate school, I knew that I wanted to focus on Native American literature, primarily contemporary Native American literature, but specifically the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition. When I started preparing for my dissertation, what I realized is that, yes, we have this really rich and complex literary tradition, but scholars weren't really studying that way. And so for me to actually study and engage with Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota literatures, I actually had to go back and reconstruct the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition. And so basically that's what I did for my dissertation. I wanted to find the very first moment that the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition appeared in print. And I was able to do that, and I traced it back to missionary papers, which, isn't surprising. Traditionally, we are an oral society. All of our stories were conveyed orally. As soon as missionaries arrived in 1834, they started writing down all of our stories, and they began publishing them in newspapers. The very first newspaper was the Dakota Friend in 1834. And the very first story I found that they had published was a story about Benishoshe, about the Minnesota River. And that was one of the first stories to appear in print. And when I first found that story, I didn't recognize it as an oral story. It looked like this, short article. It's maybe a paragraph. And it talks about the river, and it says that the Oceti Sakowin have a special relationship with the river, and this special relationship is something that they use. Their words was, it's something that Oceti Sakowin people use to feel superior to other tribes in the area. Like, that was their exact wording. That it was just a story we told ourselves to feel superior to anybody else who came into the area, which I thought was an interesting way to phrase it. And so immediately, right, from the very first moment that these missionaries put our literary tradition into print, they trivialized it, and they act like it were these stories that we just told ourselves. There wasn't any truth or relevance to them. They just thought they were these superficial, trivial stories that we told ourselves to, to claim some kind of connection to the land. That's what the missionaries said. And so this happened in 1834. As soon as the missionaries arrived and started translating these oral stories, they also started translating the Bible into Dakota. They thought the easiest way to convert and civilize the Oceti Sakowin was to have them read the Bible in their own language. And so when they first arrived, they said, okay, it'll take us, a few years to translate the Christian Bible into Dakota, Lakota. What they quickly found out is that, our language wasn't easy to translate or transcribe. They thought it would take them 1 or 2 years. I think it took them 40 years, and they still didn't get it right. It took them 40 years to translate the language, and they still didn't get it right. So it took them their entire lifetime. But during that time, during those 40 years, they published a Dakota Bible, grammar, Dakota alphabet, almost 60 books in the Dakota language. And they use these books to re-educate Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota children. They use those books to, quote, civilize those children, right? And so those were the texts that they used in boarding schools and in mission schools to Christianize and civilize Dakota children. And so 1834, we have, right, these oral stories translated into English, stripped of their cultural, linguistic meaning. And then, 30, 40 years later, we have Native children who are reading these books, and that's how they're learning about their culture and their language. And the message that they're receiving from these texts is that our culture and language is inferior. And I think you see a lot of that reflected in some of the early boarding school writings. Even, somebody like Charles Eastman, he'll use those words like savages and, things like that to describe our own people. He'll refer to them as alcoholics. And, I think what that really demonstrates is that those early boarding school students, they started to internalize what they had heard these missionaries say. And you see them start to internalize that. And I think you see that reflected in a lot of literature over the next 50 or so years. And then really in the probably, I would say, 60s and 70s, that's when Oceti Sakowin people really started to challenge those negative stereotypes that they were reading and seeing in the literature. And they started creating, I think, representations that were more positive and empowering of our communities. And that was before and during the Red Power movement. And around that same time is when you start to see authors like, Vine Deloria Jr. emerge, Elizabeth Cook-Lynn, later, Ed Valandra, and all of these writers who take a very different approach to our literary tradition, right? They're very proud of it. They're very, they want to create these positive, empowering representations of our culture and community. And then you see that happen along the same time that Native American studies starts to emerge as a legitimate academic discipline. You see that around the same times that the tribal college movement starts, where people are really trying to challenge and change these narratives about Native people. Again, that happens around the 70s, 80s. And then in the 1990s, we have the what's called as Native American literary nationalism, what literary scholars refer to as Native American literary nationalism. And we have a number of scholars who are trying to reclaim their literary traditions. And we've seen Cherokee scholars do that. We've seen, Creek scholars do that. We've seen a number of different literary scholars start to reclaim their literary traditions. And you see that with authors like, Robert Warrior, Craig Womack, Jace Weaver. They all start to recover their own literary traditions. Lisa Brooks, you see them start to do that. And then in the early 2000s, that's around the time I was ending my undergraduate work, and I didn't see anything about the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition. I didn't see much. Mm-hmm. I saw one book by Ruth Heflin, and she talks about, those early boarding school writers. But I don't see anything produced by Oceti Sakowin scholars about our own literary tradition. And so that really became, I think, the motivation for my own graduate work. I wanted to go back and reconstruct that literary tradition and see how it has changed and evolved over time. And so that's really what I dedicated my graduate studies toward, is going into the archives, finding some of these early translations, thinking about how these writers are describing their own cultures and language. And so that's really what I did throughout my graduate studies. And you see that reflected in my dissertation. I think when I wrote my dissertation, I had two options. I could either focus on one writer and analyze his or her body of work. And I chose not to do that. Instead, I decided to look at 200 years of Oceti Sakowin literary tradition. Mm-hmm. And when I first decided to do that, I think, some of my advisors thought that was too big of a project. You're supposed to narrow it down, right, to a specific writer, specific genre, whatever. But I really wanted to look at the entire Oceti Sakowin literary tradition and see how it changed over time. And it was a massive project, and it's 200 years of literature in this one dissertation. But, I used that information to really help develop this Native Reads project, because Native Reads, too, it's 200 years of the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition from the oral tradition until present, and it looks at how the literature has changed over time.